Today's video will take you inside the war as it was seen and written by German soldiers themselves, through diaries, letters, and battlefield memoirs that survived the mud, the censors, and the years, and it will show why Erich Maria remarks, "All quiet on the Western Front still feels like a live wire in the hands of anyone who reads it." This topic is loved because it strips the war of speeches and banners and leaves only the human being, the young man with a rifle, trying to stay alive while the world around him is rebuilt into ruin. In recent days, with audiences once again arguing about what war stories should show and what they should leave unsaid, these German voices have returned to the surface, forcing an old question back into the room. Was the real battle fought only in trenches or also in memory? And here is what is at stake tonight. If you listen closely enough to those private pages, you can hear the first war shaping the second, and you can watch the 20th century tighten like a fist around the same set of mistakes. I speak to you from a world still bristling with the aftershock of World War II, when maps have been redrawn, cities have been rebuilt from ash, and new rivalries have begun to harden behind closed doors. In that tense, early Cold War light, certain documents travel in quiet channels, handled carefully, stamped, translated, and studied not for comfort, but for what they reveal about morale, obedience, fear, and the limits of human endurance. Because the truth is this: long before generals wrote their memoirs, ordinary soldiers were already recording the war's real temperature. Some wrote with pride, some wrote with disgust. Many wrote with the blunt practicality of men who learned that ideals do not keep you warm. And those words, never meant for public ears, became the raw material of politics, propaganda, and secret analysis in the years that followed. So stay with me. We will begin with the first letters and diary lines that still carry early confidence, then move into the grinding routine of trench life, then follow the trail into the uneasy peace that failed to stay peaceful. We will ask the dangerous what if questions that historians debate in private and nations avoid in public. What if the war had ended sooner? What if the home front had not starved? What if veterans had been rebuilt instead of exploited? And what if the most honest testimonies had been treated as warnings instead of weapons? Now, take one step with me into that dim corridor of pages and silence where a young soldier's handwriting becomes the first clue and the story, at last, begins. I still remember the first time I handled a German field letter that had never been meant for me. Not the grand sort, not the kind written for posterity. No flourish. Just a few tight lines in a cramped hand, the ink uneven where the writer must have pressed too hard, or paused too long. It was addressed to a mother who would never again hear her son's footsteps on the stair. It tried to sound calm, even cheerful, as if calm itself could be mailed across a continent of mud and wire. That is the first thing you have to understand about the war through German soldiers' eyes. It was not one war. It was 1,000 private wars, each one fought inside the ribs. And if you want to know how those private wars helped shape everything that came afterward, you do not begin with flags or speeches. You begin with breath, with the weight of a pack, with a boy's hands trying to look like a man's. I'm speaking to you from a world that has already seen another catastrophe, and I carry that second shadow with me as I look back. We have watched a newer German army march and break and burn itself out. We have watched cities turn to ash, watched borders redraw themselves like a surgeon's pencil. We have watched the Cold War harden into habit. And so when I tell you that the First War mattered, I do not mean it in the comfortable way people say it at lecterns. I mean it the way a wound matters. It never truly goes away. It changes how you stand, how you sleep, how you remember. What I want to do is take you into the German soldier's experience without dressing it up, without turning it into a pageant. Not because Germans were uniquely tragic, or uniquely cruel, or uniquely anything, but because their written traces, their diaries and letters, and later memoirs, show something rare. They show a mind trying to keep its shape while the world around it becomes industrial. And then I want to do something that historians do privately and storytellers do openly. I want to ask the dangerous questions that float in the back of the room when nobody dares to raise a hand. What if the war had ended earlier? What if the home front had not starved? What if the soldiers had come home to a state that did not feel like betrayal? What if the most human moments in the trenches had been treated as signals, not anomalies? These are not parlor games. In the middle of the 20th century, after everything we have seen, the what if is not entertainment, it is a warning system. So come close. I'm going to speak plainly. I'm going to tell you what German soldiers wrote, what they tried not to write, what they later swore was true, and what their own words sometimes contradict. And I'm going to show you how the gap between those things became a political force. Because the war did not only kill bodies, it manufactured meanings. And meanings, once manufactured, are hard to disarm. When people say, all quiet on the Western Front, they often mean a mood, not a book. They mean the look of young men with old eyes. They mean the shock of mud and fear and the slow collapse of ideals. Remarque put it into a shape that traveled. He gave a generation a language for the feeling that the war had stolen their future and then demanded applause for it. But if you want to see the full German soldier's spectrum, you have to hold Remarque in one hand and, in the other, a very different voice. The voice of the officer who did not merely endure the storm but studied it, admired it, sometimes even loved it in a way that makes you uneasy. I am thinking of the men who wrote from the front as if they were taking inventory of their own nerves. Men like Ernst J. Unger, who began with diaries and turned them into a memoir that, for all its precision, often reads as if the war were a harsh proving ground rather than a criminal waste. He writes of attacks, of discipline, of the strange clarity that comes when death becomes routine. His pages can feel like metal, clean, cold, reflecting whatever you bring to them. And that contrast matters, because it tells you immediately that the German soldier was not a single type. The same trench could hold a man who felt only disgust and a man who felt a stern pride, and both could describe the same night with a kind of truth. The problem is that truth is not always the moment. Many of these diaries were not written as faithfully as we like to imagine. The popular myth is that a diary is pure immediacy. Today happened, therefore I wrote it tonight. But war does not grant leisure. Men scribbled fragments in pockets, or wrote in lulls, or reconstructed days later, and sometimes, knowingly or not, they shaped the events into a neat sequence to make them bearable or to make themselves coherent. Letters were stranger still. A letter is not just a report. It is a performance for an audience that includes the mother, the wife, the friend, sometimes the censor, and always the fear of being misunderstood. The writer wants to be honest, and also wants to reassure. He wants to confess, and also wants to keep the fragile world at home intact. So he chooses, he edits. He wraps the ugly parts in humor, or he avoids them entirely and talks about bread. When you read German soldiers, you are often reading a man balancing on a wire the wire between what he saw and what he can say. And that, right there, is the first. What if that should bother you? What if the war had been written more honestly in real time? What if mothers and fathers had received not the softened version, but the raw one? Would the home front have tolerated the machine as long as it did? Would the political appetite for sacrifice have survived? It is tempting to believe that truth would have ended the war sooner. But I have seen enough of the 20th century to distrust temptation. People can absorb astonishing truths when the alternative is admitting they have sent their sons into something pointless. Still, we begin with the documents we have, and in those documents, one theme returns like a cough in winter. The early war is full of energy. The later war is full of counting. Counting shells, counting rations, counting the days until leave, counting the dead without writing the number. In the first months, German letters can carry a peculiar brightness, even when describing danger. There is an idea, especially among students and young volunteers, that this is a defining test, that the nation has risen as one body, that history is unfolding, and they have been invited to stand in its center. Then the front teaches them a new curriculum. It teaches them that courage is not a shining moment, but a tired habit, that the body can go on doing things long after the mind has stopped believing, that the landscape itself can be redesigned by artillery until it no longer resembles a place where humans live. Even the language changes. Early on, you see words like honor, duty, fatherland. Later, you see mud, lice, sleep, hunger. Not because ideals vanish, but because ideals cannot keep your feet warm. There is an episode I cannot forget, described by a German soldier in a letter that reads almost like a scene witnessed from horseback. An ammunition column under fire. The sound of shells described not as thunder but as something sharp and unnatural, as if the air itself has been cut. Horses fall. Men keep unloading. They count calmly as they stack cartridges, as if counting could impose order on chaos. Someone finds time to smoke. Someone jokes about a hat full of holes. It is almost absurd until you understand that this absurd calm is the mind's last defense. The letter is remarkable not because it contains heroics, but because it contains composure. It shows you a war that has become labor. Dangerous labor, yes, but labor nonetheless. Men do the task in front of them because the task is smaller than the fear. Now, if you have read Remarque, you will recognize this truth. His characters survive by narrowing their world until it fits inside the next hour. The grand ideas become distant. The trench becomes the universe. But Gies will show you another layer. He shows you how men adapt not only by shrinking their world, but by hardening themselves to match it. He notices details with a sharpness that can feel almost clinical. He describes tactics, storms of steel, the machinery of assault. There is a fascination there, and if you are honest, it can pull you in. You can feel the temptation to see the war as something like a terrible sport, a contest of endurance and nerve. That temptation is one of the most dangerous things in the archive, because it is the same temptation that later regimes learn to weaponize. If you can make war feel like meaning, you can keep men marching long after their reason has died. This is why I insist on the full spectrum. If you only read Remarque, you will think every German soldier became a pacifist in the mud. If you only read Gies, you may think the war forged a generation of iron. The truth is that the war forged both, sometimes in the same person at different times. And here we come to the second. What if? What if the German army's internal culture had treated disillusionment as a signal rather than a weakness? In other words, what if the institutions had taken seriously the psychological rupture that soldiers were describing, instead of insisting on endurance as the only virtue? In the Great War, there were moments when armies began to understand breakdown, but often they treated it as moral failure. Men were expected to absorb the machine without cracking. When they did crack, the system often punished them. A best-case scenario would have been this: rotations that actually protected men from prolonged exposure, rest that was not merely a rumor, medical recognition of trauma without shame, and leadership that did not confuse cruelty with discipline. Would that have changed the outcome? Perhaps not. But it could have changed what happened afterward, when millions returned home carrying invisible damage. A fee. Now let me move you forward. deeper into the war, into the period when German soldiers begin writing in a colder register. By 1916 and 1917, the war is no longer a gamble for quick victory. It is a mechanism that eats time and men. Verdun becomes not a battle, but a symbol, an argument between nations conducted in blood. The Somme, the endless barrages, the sense that the earth itself is being processed. In this period, the German soldier's daily life becomes a study in deprivation and routine. You see the trench not only as a battlefield, but as a habitat. Men build deeper dugouts, reinforced shelters, systems of communication and defense designed to survive artillery. The front becomes engineered. Defense becomes layered. Even survival becomes architectural. This is the aspect that many outside Germany underestimated at the time and later romanticized. They imagined trenches as crude ditches. But German defensive thinking evolved into something more systematic, a defense in depth that tried to absorb attacks, delay them, break them, and counter them. Not because German soldiers were superhuman, but because the war forced adaptation or death. When you read accounts based on diaries, you see the tension between the human and the technological. A soldier might write about the camaraderie of a small group holding on in a quiet sector, and in the same breath write about the way new weapons and constant shelling alter what a man even feels. This is not just a tactical story. It is a moral one, because the more technical the war becomes, the more it risks making the human seem irrelevant. That is the third, what if? What if technology had been matched by diplomacy with equal urgency? In the Great War, nations raced to innovate on the battlefield while often failing to innovate at the negotiating table. There were feelers, there were proposals, there were moments when compromise could have saved lives. But political pride, fear of internal backlash, and the belief that the next offensive might break the enemy kept the machine running. A best-case scenario, and I say this carefully, would not be a fantasy victory. It would be a negotiated peace before exhaustion turned into humiliation. A peace that acknowledged losses without turning defeat into myth. If you want to understand why that matters, you need only look at what happened later. The way a war ends can be as decisive as why it begins. A society that believes it was stabbed in the back, that believes its soldiers were undefeated in the field, is a society primed for revenge. The diaries and letters, especially those written by ordinary soldiers, often show something more complex. Many knew by 1918 that the war was slipping away. They felt it in the hunger, in the thinning ranks, in the tone of officers, in the way rumors spread like smoke. But in the political arena, the story hardened into something else. And here the home front becomes unavoidable. German civilians endured shortages that grew desperate. Rations tightened. Hunger became not just discomfort, but a national condition. Soldiers at the front wrote about food because food was reality. And when the home front was starving, the moral contract between soldier and state began to fray. This becomes the fourth. What if? What if the blockade, the shortages, and the collapse of provisioning had been mitigated? I am not saying, what if war had been comfortable? War is never comfortable. I am saying, what if the home front had not been pushed into a corner, where survival itself became political? A best-case scenario would have been a Germany that, even under strain, managed to feed its civilians and soldiers well enough to avoid the deep bitterness that made people receptive to radical promises later. Hunger is not just physical. It is ideological fuel. There is a moment in the war that returns again and again in popular memory, the Christmas truce. Men on opposite sides in 1914 sing songs, exchange small gifts, step into the open, not to kill, but to stare at the enemy and find him human. People love this story because it lets them believe the war's cruelty was an accident, a temporary madness that could have been reversed if only the right hearts had spoken. I want to be careful here. Those truces were real. Those moments of recognition were real, but they were not a movement. They were a flash of humanity in a structure designed to crush it. High command did not welcome such moments. Armies do not like soldiers remembering the enemy's face. Still, if we are talking about best-case scenarios, we cannot ignore it. So here is the fifth, what if? And it is the most delicate. What if the Christmas truce had been treated as intelligence? Not military intelligence. Human intelligence. What if political and military leaders had read those spontaneous ceasefires as evidence that the war's moral foundation was weak, that ordinary men did not naturally hate each other, that they could be brought to pause? In a best-case scenario, those moments could have been used as leverage for negotiated de-escalation. Local ceasefires becoming a pattern, patterns becoming pressure, pressure forcing diplomats to act. Would it have worked? I don't know. I suspect the machinery was already too heavy. But even asking the question changes how you understand the war. It reminds you that the war was not inevitable at the level of the individual. It was imposed and maintained. It required constant reinforcement, constant narratives, constant discipline. And that brings me back to the documents, because documents are where narratives are born. Now let me speak about the ordinary soldier. Because the ordinary soldier is often where the truth hides. There is a type of memoir based on diaries that does not seek glory. It seeks explanation. A man writes years later, not as a politician, not as a general, but as someone who carried out orders and tried to keep his sense of humor intact. These accounts can be disarming. They include small absurdities, little observations about officers, the strange theater of military life, the way men laugh at themselves when laughter is the only rebellion permitted. They matter because they show you that war is lived in the details, a joke shared over bad food, the irritation of equipment, the boredom of waiting, the sudden terror that interrupts monotony like a slap. And then there are accounts from men who rejected the war altogether, who deserted or wrote against it. Those voices are rare and often filtered through translation, politics, and later interpretation. But they remind you that the war's legitimacy was never total. Even in the middle of the machine, there were men who looked at it and saw only brutality. So when someone tells you, the German soldier believed, you should ask, which soldier, which year, which front, which unit, which hunger, which letter, which diary entry. The war through German soldiers' eyes is not a single camera angle. It is a crowded room of testimony, some of it proud, some of it broken, some of it confused, and much of it shaped by the need to survive the telling. Now I want to bring you forward to 1918, because this is where the German soldiers' writing often takes on the tone of collapse. The spring offensive, the last great attempt to break the Western Front, carried an initial momentum and then bled out. Soldiers moved forward into ground that had been fought over, into landscapes shredded by years of shelling. They advanced, they took positions, they faced counterattacks, they watched the promise of decisive victory dissolve into the same familiar grind. By late 1918, morale is not simply low, it is exhausted, it is hungry, it is aware. This awareness is crucial. When a soldier begins to suspect that the war cannot be won, every sacrifice becomes suspect, every order feels heavier, every death feels less like duty and more like waste. Here again, letters become strange. Some men grow brutally honest. Others become even more careful, as if honesty would be cruelty to the people at home. Some stop writing altogether. Silence is also a source, and this is where the post-war story begins to germinate. If you want to understand the rise of bitter myths, you need to understand that many soldiers returned not only defeated but disoriented. They had lived under a military logic for years and then were released into civilian chaos. They had been told their suffering had meaning and then watched the state stagger. They had been trained to endure, not to process. In a best-case scenario, Germany would have had a reintegration that was humane and stable. It would have had a political culture capable of admitting failure without turning it into betrayal. It would have had economic structures that did not punish the returning soldier with humiliation. That best-case scenario did not happen. And because it did not happen, the soldier's memory became contested territory. Different factions fought over what the war meant. Some tried to sanctify it. Some tried to condemn it. Some tried to use it as a stepping stone to the next conflict. This is where literature becomes more than literature. It becomes a weapon and a shield. Remarque's work and other anti-war narratives threatened those who wanted the war remembered as noble sacrifice. That is why such books were attacked. Not because they were inaccurate in every detail, but because they threatened the emotional economy that certain politics required. Gionenger's voice, by contrast, could be interpreted as evidence that the war forged hardness and discipline, even if Gionenger's himself was more complex than the slogans later made him. And in between these poles, there were millions of men who did not write books, who simply carried the war inside them like a stone. Now, because you asked for what if scenarios that can spark debate, I'm going to lay them out clearly, the way I would lay them out on a desk before a long night of analysis. 4 paths, each plausible enough to argue about, each rooted in pressures we can name. First path, the early negotiated peace. Not a fantasy German victory, not a clean triumph, but a peace reached when exhaustion was visible and before humiliation became narrative. A peace that might have prevented the sense of moral robbery that later radical politics fed on. If this path had been taken, Germany's post-war politics might have been less volatile. The appeal of revenge might have been weaker. The soldier returning home might have felt grief, but not necessarily betrayal. Second path, the home front stabilized. If provisioning had been handled better, if civilians had not faced such severe hunger, if the social fabric had not been torn by scarcity and resentment, the internal collapse might have been less dramatic. A society that is not starving is harder to radicalize. Third path, the army reforms its moral contract. If leadership had recognized the psychological cost, reduced pointless punishment, rotated men more effectively, and treated breakdown as injury rather than shame, the soldier's relationship to authority could have remained less poisoned. After the war, those men might have been less drawn to movements that promised order at any price. Fourth path, the human moment becomes political leverage. If moments like the Christmas truce and the private recognition of shared suffering had been amplified rather than suppressed, they might have seeded a stronger transnational anti-war sentiment. Not enough to erase the war, perhaps, but enough to change how the next decade interpreted it. Now here is the hard truth, the one I will not soften. None of these paths was guaranteed. History is not a machine where you swap one gear and everything runs smoothly. Even in best-case scenarios, there are other pressures: imperial ambition, alliance politics, economic rivalries, nationalism, fear. But the reason these scenarios matter is that they expose where choices existed. The Great War is often described as a tragedy of inevitability. The German soldiers' documents remind you it was also a tragedy of decisions made and decisions avoided. Let me end this opening segment where I began with the small human voice. When you read a soldier's diary entry written on a day that was too busy for full sentences, you see the war stripped of philosophy. A few words, a place name, a note about hunger, a brief mention of a friend hit by shellfire, and the way the day simply continued. And then, later, you see how that same diary becomes a memoir, expanded, shaped, made coherent. The war becomes a story, the man becomes a narrator. This is not deceit. It is survival. A human being cannot live forever in fragments. He tries to build meaning out of shock, because meaning is the only thing that makes pain tolerable. But the danger is that once meaning is built, it can be sold. That is the lesson I carry into the Cold War world I live in now. We talk about ideology, about power, the struggle of systems. But systems are fed by stories, and stories are fed by memory, and memory is often born in trenches, written in pencil by a hand that is shaking. So when you look at the Great War through German soldiers' eyes, do not look for a single verdict. Look for the process. Watch the enthusiasm dim into routine. Watch routine harden into numbness. Watch numbness break into bitterness. Watch bitterness become political material. And then ask yourself the most unsettling question of all. If you had been there, with the same hunger, the same fear, the same exhaustion, what story would you have needed in order to keep going? If you're talking about this in class, or arguing about it with someone who thinks war is only generals and maps, pass it along. The documents do not belong to the loudest voice. They belong to anyone willing to read them without flinching. But there is one more thing those pages belong to, and it is the thing most people avoid admitting. They belong to the people who come after, the ones who inherit the wreckage and try to decide what it means. So, let me pull you a little closer to the desk where I work, because this is where the story takes a sharper turn. Here is the hook I want you to hold in your mind while we go forward. What if the Great War had ended in a way that did not poison the peace? Not a fantasy ending. Not a clean victory for anyone. Just an ending shaped with enough restraint, enough honesty, enough practical mercy that the men who survived could return without feeling they had been thrown away. Because I have read what those men wrote when they came home, and I have watched what their memories were turned into afterward. And if you want to understand the 20th century, you have to understand that the Great War did not end in 1918. It ended, and then it kept ending over and over inside the minds of those who lived through it. In the last months of the fighting, a new word begins to creep into German soldiers' writing, even when they do not write it plainly. Futility. You will not always see it in big statements. You see it in the way the tone tightens, in the way the future disappears from sentences, in the way men stop describing the landscape and start describing the clock. The later war is full of waiting, and then sudden movement, and then waiting again. It is full of rumors, the sort that travel faster than any official message. Rumors about food, about leaves, about reinforcements, about peace talks, about collapse. Some soldiers still write with discipline, still describe their tasks as if the war is a job that must be completed. Others begin to write like men who have seen too much to believe any longer in heroic language. And many, I suspect, stop writing because words feel like a luxury the war no longer allows. This matters because when the armistice comes, the end is not experienced as a clean conclusion. It arrives like a door that has been slammed without explanation. One day the machine is still running. The next, the machine is told to shut down. And if a man has lived inside a machine for 4 years, being told to shut it down is not peace, it is withdrawal. Now I want you to imagine that moment, not in a courtroom, not in a treaty hall, but in a railway station, a crowd, a uniform that no longer has a purpose, a man stepping into civilian life with a mind trained for danger. Then I want you to imagine something else. What if the homecoming had been treated as an operation, with the same seriousness the war had demanded? That is the first best case scenario I want to lay before you, and it is not romantic. It is administrative. It is medical. It is social. In that best case world, Germany prepares for demobilization the way an engineer prepares to dismantle a bridge without dropping it on the people underneath. There are reception systems. Food is waiting. Jobs are planned. Housing is organized. Trauma is treated as injury, not weakness. Veterans are not left to drift into corners where bitterness can ferment, because bitterness is not born out of thin air. It is cultivated by neglect. In the world that actually unfolded, millions returned to scarcity, uncertainty, political upheaval, and a sense that their suffering had been cashed in by others. And once that feeling takes root, it becomes easy to sell a dangerous promise order: pride, revenge, a second chance to make the sacrifice feel worthwhile. I am speaking carefully, but I will not pretend. When later movements recruited from veterans, they were recruiting from a population already primed by chaos. So here is the question you should argue about with your classmates. If Germany had built a serious reintegration system, would the politics of rage have found the same fuel? You can't prove a counterfactual, but you can test plausibility. And the plausibility is strong enough to make the question worth asking. Now let me widen the lens, because the end of the war is not only about soldiers. It is about the story the state tells those soldiers. In Germany, one of the most corrosive post-war ideas was the belief that the army had not truly been defeated in the field, that something at home had undermined it. I'm not here to argue slogans. I'm here to tell you that the soldiers' documents often do not support the clean fantasy. Many soldiers knew the condition they were in. They knew the hunger. They knew the exhaustion. They knew the thinning lines. They knew, at least in their bones, that the machine was failing. But the public story, once politics began chewing on it, often moved away from the messy truth and toward a cleaner, more profitable myth. So here is the second best case scenario. What if the ending had been narrated honestly, immediately, and relentlessly? Imagine a Germany where civilian leaders and military leaders stand together and say, "We have been outlasted, we are broken, the war cannot continue," and to continue would be to waste the living for a symbol. No scapegoats, no romantic denial, no promises of an inevitable second round. It sounds simple. It is not. Leaders fear being branded traitors. They fear being torn apart by their own factions. They fear that honest defeat will spark revolution. But I have learned, watching governments under strain, that the story you tell at the end becomes the soil your next decade grows in. An honest ending is not just moral. It is strategic. Because if the soldier returns to a state that tells the truth, he may still be angry, but his anger has fewer targets that can be weaponized. Now let me connect this to the German soldiers writing again. Letters and diaries are not only personal, they are political raw material. They can be mined later to support whatever story a faction wants to tell. A man who wrote about endurance can be used as a banner for militarism. A man who wrote about disgust can be used as a banner for pacifism. A man who wrote about hunger can be used as evidence of betrayal at home or evidence of structural collapse. So the question is not simply what soldiers experienced. The question is who gets to interpret it. That is where books like Miep Gies become lightning rods, because a powerful anti-war narrative threatens the myth merchants. It tells the public, in a form they can feel, that sacrifice does not automatically equal meaning. In a best-case scenario, that narrative is not treated as treason. It is treated as a necessary corrective. Imagine a Germany where the culture leans into that honest pain rather than trying to silence it. Imagine public conversation that says, yes, it was terrible, and no, it was not glorious, and we will not romanticize it for the sake of pride. Would that have immunized the country against later fanaticism? Not completely. But it might have lowered the fever. Now I want to bring you into a quieter room, one you don't usually see in popular retellings. In the years after the First War, and especially in the years before the Second, there were people studying these soldier writings not as literature, but as intelligence. I do not mean espionage in the dramatic sense. I mean analysts trying to understand how a nation thinks, how a military endures, how morale collapses, how propaganda works, how a society can be pushed into total war. This is where the declassified feeling becomes more than a style. It becomes a truth about how documents travel. A private diary can become a public weapon. A humble letter can become a training example for psychological operations. A soldier's complaint about hunger can become a data point in a strategic assessment. And that leads to the third best case scenario. What if, after the war, the world had treated soldier testimony as early warning rather than as decoration? In other words, what if the international system had looked at the diaries and letters and said, this is what industrial war does to human beings, and if we allow conditions that produce the next war, we will be complicit. This is where you can see a fork in the road. One path leads to symbolic gestures and fragile institutions that cannot withstand economic shocks and political extremists. The other path, the best-case path, leads to stronger economic stabilization, more serious enforcement against paramilitary violence, and more honest international engagement with a defeated nation so that defeat does not harden into grievance. I am not describing charity. I am describing prevention. And yes, I can hear the argument already because it always comes. Why should the world soften terms for the defeated? Because if the goal is peace, the goal is not to humiliate. The goal is to reduce the incentives for revenge. That is not sentimental. It is practical. It is cold. It is the kind of logic you learn when you have watched revenge cycles ruin countries. So ask yourself, what if post-war policy had been designed around preventing psychological and economic collapse rather than punishing symbols? Would the next catastrophe have been harder to sell? Let's get specific, because what if only matters when you can anchor it to real pressures. Here are 4 alternate paths you can debate, each one tied to something that truly existed. First alternate path, a peace before exhaustion becomes humiliation. The war ends not in a mood of collapse and shock, but in a negotiated settlement reached earlier when both sides can still claim dignity. Germany is not treated as permanently tainted. Germany is not allowed to pretend it was never beaten. The ending is sober, not theatrical. In that world, veterans return to hardship, but not to a national story of theft and betrayal. The political center holds more easily. Second alternate path, a republic that protects its streets. After the war, the state asserts control over paramilitary violence quickly and consistently. It does not allow armed groups to become political muscle. It does not tolerate private armies in uniforms of grievance. In that world, the traumatized veteran has fewer organized funnels into extremist militias. The young men who crave belonging find it in civic institutions rather than in violent fraternities. Third alternate path, a veteran policy that treats the mind as part of the body. Hospitals, employment programs, community structures, and public acknowledgement of trauma become national priorities. Not hidden in shame, not whispered about. Addressed. In that world, the soldier's anger is less easily converted into a political weapon because his pain is not ignored. Fourth alternate path, an honest cultural consensus. Books like Miep are not framed as attacks on the nation. They are framed as testimony. The society allows itself to mourn openly. It rejects the temptation to rewrite suffering as glory. In that world, militarism has a harder time selling itself as moral redemption. Now, none of these paths guarantees a different 20th century, but each one removes a piece of the kindling that later fires required. And I want you to notice something. All 4 best-case paths share one theme. They treat truth as stability. They treat human reality as a strategic asset, not an inconvenience. Now, I have to tell you about a different kind of document, because it complicates everything. Propaganda. During and after the Great War, diaries and letters were sometimes collected and presented as evidence not for understanding, but for persuasion. In wartime, the hunger for proof is relentless. People want documents that confirm what they already believe, because belief is easier to maintain than uncertainty. Here is the danger. Once soldier testimony becomes a tool in moral campaigns, it becomes difficult to separate the human from the political use. A best-case scenario here would be a world where soldier documents are treated with disciplined context, where investigators and journalists and governments resist the temptation to quote selectively and instead build a full picture. This is not an abstract point. Selective use of testimony can harden hatred. It can close off empathy. It can make future reconciliation harder. It can turn a complex war into a simple morality play, which is a comfortable story that often leads to uncomfortable futures. So here is a fifth best-case scenario. What if the post-war world had built a shared discipline around evidence, international norms for handling testimony, clear standards, transparent context, a refusal to use private grief as public ammunition? That kind of discipline sounds unrealistic, and in the fever of war it often is. But the world that emerged after 1945 did begin to build stronger norms in certain areas, precisely because of what had gone wrong before. And that is why this matters now, in my era, when we live with a new global tension that feeds on narratives. In the Cold War, stories are weapons too. Now, let me bring you back down to ground level, to the soldier himself, because the soldier's view is the thread that keeps us honest. When you read German accounts from the Great War, you find recurring anchors that ignore political borders. Commodation, hunger, exhaustion, fear, routine, sudden chaos, the private relief of survival, the private guilt of surviving. And then, after the war, you find the struggle to explain those anchors to people who were not there. That struggle produces two types of stories. The first is the story that says, "It was terrible, therefore we must never do it again." The second is the story that says it was terrible, therefore it must have meant something, therefore we must redeem it. That second story is the trap, because once you decide suffering must be redeemed, you can be led into repeating it. This is why the German soldiers' documents are so important. They show you the raw material out of which both stories are built. They show you the crossroads where interpretation becomes destiny. So here is the question I want to leave ringing in your head. If you had been 19, living in mud, watching friends disappear, coming home to hunger and political chaos, which story would you choose? Would you choose the story that demands a clean break from war? Or would you choose the story that promises to make the sacrifice worth something? Now, I know what we prefer to think. We like to imagine we would choose the noble, calm, rational path. But history is full of rational people making irrational choices when their pain is given a flag. So I don't ask this question to judge those men. I ask it to warn you about how easily pain can be recruited. Before I close this stretch of the narrative, let me give you one last what if, the one that always feels too large until you remember how often large disasters turn on small decisions. What if, in the decade after the Great War, German veterans had been invited into civic life as builders instead of being courted by factions as weapons? Imagine local councils, rebuilding projects, infrastructure work, national service focused on reconstruction rather than aggression. Imagine a society that says to its returning soldiers, "We need your discipline and your endurance, not for marching, but for rebuilding." In that world, the veteran's skills become a public good rather than a political threat. His identity becomes tied to construction rather than destruction. Would it have stopped every extremist? No. But it would have changed the ratio, and in history, ratios matter. Because movements do not need everyone, they need enough. Now, I'm going to stop at the edge of a very particular doorway, because what comes next is where the German soldier's voice begins to echo forward into the second catastrophe, even when the soldier himself never intended it. There is a moment, years later, when a new generation reads the old testimonies and misreads them on purpose. They take endurance and call it destiny. They take discipline and call it purity. They take pain and call it proof that the nation must be hardened. And in quiet offices, far from the trenches, men decide which books are safe, which voices are dangerous, and which memories will be permitted to speak. I remember sitting with a thin packet of translated excerpts, pages that had been handled by more than one set of hands, each hand leaving its own invisible fingerprint of intention. The words inside were not secret, because they were dramatic. They were secret because they were honest, and honesty is inconvenient to those who are preparing the next march. When I open that packet fully, the story shifts from the trenches to the struggle over memory itself. And that is where the next stretch begins. When I open that packet, the first thing I notice is not the words, it is the stamp. A blunt little mark that tells you a document has passed through hands that did not want it wandering, the kind of mark that does not scream, but does not apologize either. And when you live long enough in the middle of the 20th century, you learn that stamps like that are often more revealing than signatures. They tell you what a government fears. Inside, the pages are thin and practical. Translated excerpts, field letters, diary fragments. A few passages from memoirs that began as hurried notes written in the dark. All of it German, all of it human, and all of it dangerous to someone at some point, or it would not be in a packet like this. Now here is the hook I want you to hold steady as we go forward. What if the true German soldier's story, the unromantic one, the one made of hunger and routine and dread, had been allowed to become the nation's shared memory instead of being turned into political ammunition? Because the moment you ask that question, you stop treating the war as a closed chapter and start seeing it as a live wire running straight into everything that followed. Between the end of the First War and the beginning of the Second, Germany lived in a long corridor of unstable light. One door had closed in 1918, but the air in the corridor was still thick with gunpowder and argument. The state was new, the street was restless, the economy was wounded, and the veteran was everywhere. Sometimes with a job, sometimes without, often with a head full of things he could not explain to anyone who hadn't lived them. This is where diaries and letters change their function. In the trenches they were survival tools. At home they become evidence. Evidence in courtrooms of public opinion. Evidence in political speeches. Evidence in the struggle over who gets to define what happened and why. I have seen how this works in more than one country. You do not control the future only by controlling factories or ballots. You control it by controlling the narrative that sits inside people's bones. And the German soldiers' narrative was up for sale. One faction said the war had been a noble sacrifice, ruined by weak politicians. Another said the war had been a crime committed by empires and paid for by the young. Another tried to turn the soldier into a saint of discipline. Another tried to turn him into a victim of class and hunger. And behind every one of those stories was a simple practical goal: power. So when you read the German soldiers' documents, you have to read them twice. First as testimony, then as raw material, because the world that followed did not merely remember the war, it processed it. It extracted what it needed. It discarded what it didn't. That is where literature becomes more than literature. A book like All Quiet on the Western Front is not just a novel. It is a grenade tossed into a room that wants to pretend the war was clean. It says the quiet parts out loud: the fear, the confusion, the bitterness, the loss of youth, the sense that the old men spoke of glory while the young men learned how to die. And on the other side, a memoir like WWII Diaries can be presented. rightly or wrongly, as proof that war forges strength and meaning. It can be used to feed a hunger for hardness. I am not here to flatten these writers into slogans. Both are more complicated than the factions that tried to claim them. But I am here to tell you what happened to their words once politics got its hands on them. Their words became weapons. In those years, there was a quiet kind of literacy that spread through certain circles. Not the literacy of novels for pleasure. The literacy of men who read to prepare. A young man would read a trench memoir not to understand suffering, but to imagine himself enduring it. He would read a war diary not to mourn, but to borrow the posture of toughness. He would read the language of sacrifice the way a salesman studies a pitch. And this is where my packet begins to feel less like history and more like warning. Because if you trace the chain carefully, you see how the memory of the First War was used to manufacture consent for the Second. There is a temptation, especially among people who love clean timelines, to treat the Second War as a separate eruption. But any German soldier who marched again in 1939 was marching with ghosts on his shoulders, whether he admitted it or not. Some of those ghosts whispered never again. Others whispered, this time we finish what we started. And that difference was not an accident. It was cultivated. Here is a best-case scenario that sounds almost too simple until you think about it seriously. What if the German public culture had made space for honest mourning? Not sentimental mourning, structured mourning, national rituals that acknowledged pain without turning it into rage, schools that taught the war as a human tragedy rather than as a legend of betrayal, public discussion that allowed veterans to say, without shame, that they were broken. In that best-case world, the war's memory becomes a restraint instead of a fuel, because when a society mourns honestly, it becomes harder to sell it a second sacrifice as redemption. But when a society is forced to swallow its grief, it tends to spit it out later as violence. Now let's talk about the men who wanted to control which memories were permitted to breathe. They learned an old truth with new urgency. If you want a nation to march, you must first teach it what to remember. So books were judged not on literary merit, but on usefulness. A story that made war look like waste was treated as dangerous. A story that could be read as discipline was treated as valuable. Even better, from the perspective of those preparing conflict, was a story that could do both. A story that acknowledged horror, but insisted that horror could be transcended through national will. This is the trick. It is the most effective trick of the 20th century. You do not deny the pain, you recruit it. You do not say war is pleasant. You say war is sacred. And when you say that often enough, the young believe they are volunteering for meaning, not slaughter. Now here is a second best-case scenario that deserves serious debate. What if in the early years of political instability, Germany's democratic institutions had treated extremist propaganda as a national security threat rather than as mere speech? I say this carefully. Censorship is a dangerous tool. In the wrong hands, it becomes the same disease you are trying to prevent. But there is a difference between suppressing debate and protecting a fragile republic from organized violence and incitement. In a best-case world, the state enforces law consistently against paramilitary intimidation. It protects public space from being controlled by gangs in uniforms. It keeps elections from being conducted under threat. It insists that political competition is civil, not armed. Why does this belong in a story about soldier diaries? Because veterans, especially young veterans, were prime targets for militarized politics. They had already lived in a hierarchy. They were already familiar with comradeship and obedience. They were often hungry for belonging, and if the Republic does not offer belonging, someone else will. So you ask the question plainly, What if the returning soldier had been offered a civic identity strong enough to outcompete the militant one? Not an identity built on resentment, but one built on reconstruction. The packet in front of me contains a few pages that I suspect were used exactly for this kind of analysis. A passage about fear turning into routine. A passage about small unit cohesion. Men enduring because they cannot abandon their friends. A passage about hunger eroding discipline. A passage about the strange calm men can adopt under fire, like workers finishing a job. These are not just literary moments. They are insights into morale. And morale, in the 20th century, became a science. By the time we reach the Second War, governments are no longer merely raising armies. They are managing human endurance. They are trying to predict breaking points and postpone them. Which leads me to the next hook, the one that pulls the First War into the Second. What if the German high command in the Second War had actually learned the human lessons of the First, rather than only the tactical ones? Because Germany did learn tactics. It learned mobility, coordination, the value of speed, the use of combined arms. It learned how to cut through static fronts and create shock. For a time, those lessons worked. But the human lessons were more brutal and more valuable: the inevitability of exhaustion, the limits of endurance, the danger of overpromising victory, the way hunger turns discipline into cynicism, the way long war corrodes belief. In a best-case scenario, any leadership that had truly absorbed those lessons would have avoided a war of attrition. It could not win. It would have recognized that a nation cannot fight indefinitely on slogans. It would have understood that every extra month of war creates not only casualties but moral ruin. And yet the Second War became a march toward exactly the kind of attrition that the First should have warned against. At this point, I need to make a difficult transition, because some people will say it is unfair to connect the First War's soldier documents to the Second War's catastrophe. But the connection is not moral equivalence. It is historical continuity. The First War produced a generation trained to endure and to obey, trained to accept suffering as normal, trained to see violence as a tool of state policy. Not every man trained that way became a fanatic. Many became quiet. Many became tired. Many wanted only peace. But the existence of that training at scale mattered. So we move into the Second War, and the German soldier's eye returns, altered by new ideologies and a broader brutality. Still, the soldier remains a human being in a uniform, watching the same basic mechanisms of war operate on his body: hunger, cold, fear, comradeship, fatigue. This is where a document like a Stalingrad diary excerpt becomes more than an odd add-on. It becomes an echo. A German soldier in 1942 can begin with confidence, with promises of victory, with dreams of medals and return. And then, as the situation collapses, he writes like a man watching meaning drain away. The tone shifts from belief to bitterness, from future to survival. If you have read the First War Diaries, you recognize the rhythm instantly. The First War taught the rhythm. The Second War repeated it on a greater scale. Now here is a third best-case scenario, and it is one that will make people argue in the comments because it touches pride and blame and ideology. What if Germany, having lived through one attritional disaster, had been structurally incapable of choosing another? What would that require? It would require leadership that is restrained by institutions. It would require a political culture that treats war as last resort rather than as redemption. It would require an economy and public life designed for stability rather than for mobilized rage. It would require a generation taught to distrust romantic violence. In other words, it would require the exact opposite of what extremist politics built. So the best-case scenario is not a clever battlefield shift. It is a cultural immune system. And the question becomes, could that immune system have been built in the 1920s? If you believe it could, then the soldier diaries become more than witness accounts. They become missed opportunities. They become proof that the warning signs were available. VI now, let me make this feel less like theory and more like what it looks like on the ground. Imagine a veteran in 1923 or 1929 or 1932. He has a war in his mind and a collapsed economy in his pocket. He has pride, yes, but also humiliation. He has comradeship memories that are stronger than most civilian friendships because they were forged under threat. He walks past a meeting hall and hears a speech that says, "You were not wrong to suffer. You were robbed. You were betrayed. We will restore meaning to your sacrifice." That speech is not compelling because it is accurate. It is compelling because it offers a story that reduces chaos to a single cause and offers revenge as resolution. Now, imagine a different hall in a best-case world. A hall where the veteran hears you suffered because industrial war is a machine that devours men. You were used by states that promised glory. We will rebuild your life, and we will build a country that will not ask this of you again. That speech is less intoxicating because it is less dramatic. But it is stabilizing, so the question becomes brutally practical. In the competition between intoxicating stories and stabilizing stories, which one tends to win when people are hungry? The answer is uncomfortable. The intoxicating story has an advantage. That is why best-case scenarios require more than good speeches. They require material stability. Food, jobs, housing, security. The things that make people less desperate for myth. I'm going to lay out 3 more what-if paths, each one focused on a lever that actually existed. First path, economic stabilization early and firmly. The post-war economy, under strain and then shock, becomes a breeding ground for radical promises. In a best-case world, stabilization arrives sooner, coordinated internationally with enough seriousness that the middle class is not pulverized, that savings are not wiped out, that desperation does not become universal. Would economic stability alone stop extremist politics? Not always. But it starves them of recruits. Second path, a national narrative built on accountability instead of denial. Instead of searching for scapegoats, the state says we made choices, we lost. We will rebuild without revenge. Veterans are honored as survivors, not as tools for future war. The war is taught as warning, not as prophecy. Third path, reintegration that treats veterans as builders. Public works. Infrastructure. Civic service. Not militarized youth programs, not private armies. Reconstruction as national purpose. These 3 paths are not glamorous. They do not make for neat hero scenes. But history is often decided by unglamorous systems. Now, because you asked for a viral history script, I'm going to speak to you directly for a moment, the way I would if you were across the table from me. If you want your audience to lean forward, do not let them hide behind the comfort of hindsight. Make them answer a question that forces them to confront human psychology. Here is that question. If you were a German soldier who survived the trenches, came home to hunger and humiliation, and then watched politicians argue, while your life fell apart, what would you have demanded? Justice, revenge, bread, order. And if someone offered you all 4 in a single package, wrapped in a flag, how long would it take before you stopped asking what it would cost? That is where the comment section will light up, because it is not about Germany only. It is about any society that uses grievance as fuel. I return to my packet and I realize something that always strikes me in these archives. The quietest documents are often the most explosive. A diary note that says almost nothing can tell you everything about morale. A letter that tries to sound cheerful can reveal a man's terror in what it does not say. A memoir written years later can reveal not only what happened, but what the writer needed to believe afterward in order to live with it. And then, in the next decade, Those same documents can be used by men who never saw the front to persuade boys to go. That is the shadow of testimony. So here is a final best-case scenario for this segment, and it may be the hardest to imagine because it requires discipline from everyone. What if societies had treated war testimony as sacred in the true sense, not as propaganda material, but as something that demands care, not something to exploit, something to protect? In that best-case world, a soldier's diary is not a banner. It is a warning flare. It is taught with context, with humility, with the explicit message that suffering does not ennoble a nation, it only scars it. And if that had been done after the First War, the Second War might have found fewer eager hands. So I'm going to close this stretch the way I began it, with the stamp and the fear behind it. Somebody, sometime, decided these words needed to be managed. Maybe to protect sources, maybe to protect reputations, maybe to protect a narrative. But the effect is the same. Once you manage testimony, you begin shaping memory. Once you shape memory, you begin shaping behavior. And that is the true secret chronicle of the 20th century. Not just what happened in trenches, but what happened afterward in classrooms, in meeting halls, in publishing offices, in police stations, in ministries, in the quiet places where a nation decides what it will allow itself to remember. In the next stretch, I'm going to take you into the most unsettling part of this story. The moment when a new war begins to cannibalize the memory of the old one, and when the German soldier's voice, once private and human, is either silenced, recruited, or forced to speak in code. Before you move on past this to classmates and friends who think, what if is only a game? It isn't. It's a way of spotting the levers that still exist in the world you live in. And I'll leave you with one question that should keep you awake longer than you'd like. When the next crisis comes, who will be allowed to tell the story of it, and who will be told to stay quiet? And that question is not rhetorical. I have watched it get answered in ink and in silence, in public bans and private warnings, in the way certain books vanish from shelves while other books multiply like marching orders. I have watched it answered by men who never carried a rifle, but who understood something every soldier learns too late. If you can command the story, you can command the future. So let me take you through the last turn of the corridor, where the German soldier's voice is no longer just a voice from the trenches, but a contested instrument in a newer war, and then in the uneasy peace that followed. Here is the hook that matters now, right at the end. What if Germany's soldier testimony from the First War onward had been treated as a national restraint instead of a national resource? Not a slogan. A restraint, a hard limit, a shared agreement that the written record of what war does to young men would never again be used to sell war as redemption. Because the closest thing we have to a map of the 20th century is not drawn by diplomats. It is written by soldiers who did not know they were drafting the future. In the years when the new regime tightened its grip, the soldier's memory became a matter of state policy. It is easy to say that now, with the benefit of distance. But living through that era, even as an observer, you could feel the pressure building. The air thickened with certainty. The old complexity was treated like weakness. Books were judged not for what they revealed, but for what they did to morale. And morale, in those years, was not just a military concern. It was a civic one. If you wanted the population to accept sacrifice again, you had to manage what the last sacrifice meant. You could not allow a national consensus to form around the idea that the Great War had been an absurd waste. That idea made the next call to arms harder to sell. So the cultural battle was fought early. The war books that emphasized disillusionment, loss, and the betrayal of youth were treated as corrosive, not because they were unpatriotic in some simple sense, but because they threatened the emotional infrastructure the state needed to build. At the same time, other texts were framed differently, accounts that could be interpreted as discipline, endurance, hardness, comradeship, were elevated, quoted, repeated. Sometimes the writers were more nuanced than their admirers. Nuance did not matter. Useful fragments mattered. If you've ever watched propaganda at close range, you learn its method. It does not create everything from nothing. It harvests. It selects. It trims away what complicates. It repeats what serves. It turns human testimony into a predictable instrument. This is where the German soldier's voice begins to split into two tracks. One track is private. Men still write letters home. Men still keep diaries, though not as many and not as freely. Men still confess, though often between the lines. They complain about cold, about hunger, about the distance between what is promised and what is endured. They describe the daily labor of survival that never appears in speeches. The other track is public. It is the soldier as symbol, the soldier as proof, the soldier as a figure meant to reassure the nation that sacrifice is noble, that victory is inevitable, that obedience is purity. You cannot understand the Second War without understanding that split. Because the split is how nations march into catastrophe while believing they are marching into destiny. Now I want you to hold a best-case scenario up against that reality and see how sharp the contrast is. What if the early public culture had protected complexity? Imagine institutions that defended open scholarship and honest testimony, not because honesty is pleasant, but because it is stabilizing. Imagine a society that refuses to treat pain as political property. Imagine that instead of chasing the emotional high of national redemption, the public conversation stayed anchored in the unglamorous truth war eats its own children first. If you can imagine that, you can imagine how much harder it becomes to recruit a generation into a second sacrifice. Not impossible, but harder. And harder is sometimes the only margin history gives you. Then the Second War arrives, and the German soldier's eyes see a world that is both familiar and transformed. Familiar because the body still responds the same way to fear and fatigue. Familiar because comradeship still becomes a lifeline. Familiar because the soldier still learns quickly that promises belong to the rear, while reality belongs to the front. Transformed because this war grows wider and harsher, and because the state's control over narrative is more complete. The soldier is asked not only to fight, but to believe in a total explanation, and when a war carries an all-encompassing ideology, the soldier's private doubts become not just personal weakness, but political danger. That is why so much writing from this period feels coded when you encounter it later. Men talk about weather and rations and movement, and in the gaps you sense what cannot be said aloud. I have handled documents from that era where the most revealing thing is what never appears. A man will describe his longing for home with painful care, but will not mention certain operations at all. He will describe the weight of marching, but not the reason. He will write in a tone of obedience because he has learned the cost of sounding uncertain, and still, even under those constraints, the old rhythm returns. Confidence at the start. Routine. Where then, the moment when belief begins to drain away, not in a dramatic revelation, but in a quiet accumulation of facts the body cannot ignore. The Stalingrad entries that circulate in excerpt form are a brutal example of that rhythm. At the beginning, there is faith. There is talk of nearing victory. There is the bright future the state has promised. And then the writing tightens, the confidence erodes, the tone shifts toward despair and anger. The war becomes not an adventure but a trap. Now, if you only watch speeches, you do not learn this. Speeches do not reveal collapse until collapse is undeniable. But the soldier's private pages reveal it early, the way a man's cough reveals illness before the diagnosis is spoken. So here is a best-case scenario that cuts straight through the romance people sometimes attach to history. What if leaders, in any war, treated soldier testimony as a strategic alarm bell? In the best-case world, private reports of morale collapse, hunger, exhaustion, and disbelief trigger de-escalation rather than escalation. Not because leaders suddenly become saints, but because they understand the basic arithmetic. When the human system fails, the military system fails, and the political consequences outlast any tactical gain. But in reality, leaders often respond to early warning with more pressure, more discipline, more narrative control, because admitting limits feels like surrender. That is how wars extend themselves past the point of reason. Fear. When Germany collapses in 1945, the soldier's voice does not become simpler. It becomes heavier. Men return again, this time from a war that ended in ruin. They return to a landscape of shattered infrastructure, displaced families, uncertainty, and shame. They return to a country that must rebuild not only its cities but its moral vocabulary. And now the question of testimony becomes even more delicate. What does a soldier say when the state he served is discredited? What does he confess? What does he deny? What does he rewrite in his own mind just to remain a person? This is where I must speak carefully, because it is easy to become cruel in judgment, and cruelty is not analysis. But it is also easy to become sentimental, and sentimentality is a lie. The post-war soldier's memory is often a negotiation. Some men lean into denial, some lean into guilt, some lean into exhaustion and refuse to speak at all. And many, I suspect, tell themselves a version of events that makes survival bearable. This is not unique to Germany. Any society that loses a war faces a struggle over meaning. But in Germany, the struggle is intensified by the scale of destruction and by what the regime had done in the name of the nation. So the record becomes fragmented again. The quiet veteran at a kitchen table, the official interrogations, the cautious memoirs, the testimony at trials, the stories whispered and the stories shouted. And in the middle of all this, the older Great War voices still sit on the shelf like a first wound that never healed properly. The men who survived both wars carry a double burden: 2 catastrophes, 2 sets of ghosts, and a lifetime of trying to decide whether they were actors or passengers. Now here is the best-case scenario people rarely ask, because it feels too moral to be practical. What if Germany after 1945 had built a national culture of accountability without falling into a culture of permanent humiliation? Accountability is necessary. Without it, the future is built on rot. But humiliation is dangerous. It turns introspection into resentment. It makes people hunger for a story that flips shame into pride. In the best-case world, a defeated society is helped to rebuild materially and pressured to rebuild morally, without being encouraged to rebuild politically around revenge. This matters because it is one of the few genuine lessons the mid-century world begins painfully to absorb. By the time we reach the early Cold War, it is clear that stability is not charity. It is containment of future catastrophe. And so the soldier's testimony enters a new phase. It becomes evidence for new systems of intelligence and policy. IV. This is where my packet, with its stamp and its thin pages, belongs. In the early Cold War years, governments and analysts are trying to understand what makes a society break, what makes armies endure, what makes propaganda effective, what makes populations tolerate prolonged sacrifice. The German experience becomes a grim case study. And suddenly, the soldier's diary is no longer only literature or memory. It is data. Not cold data because it is still written by human hands, but data nonetheless. A line about hunger becomes an indicator of logistical strain. A line about jokes under fire becomes a sign of unit cohesion. A sudden silence in correspondence becomes an indicator of operational intensity. A shift from confidence to bitterness becomes a morale curve. If you find that unsettling, You should. It is the modern world taking the most intimate human testimony and turning it into part of a system. But it is also unavoidable. States learn, whether we like it or not. They learn from other states' collapses. They learn from other armies' failures. They learn from the psychology hidden in the margins. So here is the central question that ties everything together, the one that makes this a secret chronicle, even when it is written in plain language. Will the soldier's voice be used to prevent war or to optimize it? Because you can do both with the same material. You can read trench diaries and conclude, never again. Or you can read them and conclude, here is how to keep men going longer. That is the moral fork, and we are not immune to it. Now let me give you a clear set of alternate paths. The kind that viewers can argue about for hours, because each one changes the chain of events in a different place. I'm going to frame them as best-case scenarios, but I'm going to keep them anchored to real levers, not fantasy miracles. Scenario 1: the Great War ends earlier with a negotiated settlement that preserves dignity without feeding denial. In this path, the war is not allowed to grind into total exhaustion. The ending is not staged in a way that invites myths of betrayal. Leaders tell the truth quickly. The public is forced to process loss honestly. Veterans return to hardship, but not to a national story of theft. In this best case, the political center in the 1920s is less brittle. Extremist factions have less fertile ground. The soldier's bitterness exists, but it is not given an organized funnel toward revenge. Scenario 2. Post-war Germany builds veteran reintegration as a national priority. Jobs, housing, medical care, and public recognition of trauma are treated as essential to stability. Veterans are offered civic belonging through reconstruction, not paramilitary belonging through street politics. In this best case, the veteran becomes a builder rather than a weapon. The energy that would have fed militias feeds infrastructure. Scenario 3: the Republic asserts a monopoly on force and refuses to tolerate private armies. Public space is protected. Political violence is treated as an existential threat to democracy. The state enforces law consistently, not selectively. In this best case, extremist recruitment is harder. Street intimidation is less effective. Politics remains contested, but not militarized. Scenario 4: cultural memory is shaped by honest mourning rather than romantic redemption. War literature that exposes the human cost is not treated as treason. Education and public rituals emphasize tragedy and restraint. The soldier's testimony becomes a warning instead of a banner. In this best case, war becomes harder to sell as moral cleansing. Scenario 5: the international system treats defeated stability as prevention, not as indulgence. Economic stabilization arrives early. Humiliation is avoided, not out of kindness, but out of practical fear of what humiliation produces. Accountability is enforced, but revenge is denied. In this best case, the global conditions that allow a second catastrophe are weaker. Now, if you want a debate that actually matters, ask your audience this: which scenario is most plausible, and which one would have mattered most? The trick is that people will choose different answers depending on what they believe about human nature. Some will say economics is everything. Some will say culture is everything. Some will say institutions are everything. The truth is that disasters usually require alignment: a weak economy, weak institutions, and a story that makes the unbearable feel meaningful. Change any one of those, and you change the probability of catastrophe. Not certainty, probability. And in history, probability is often the only thing you can influence. Now I want to bring this back to the soldier, because it is easy to get lost in systems and forget the human being who wrote the first line. The German soldier's record across the century shows you a repeating pattern that is almost cruel in its simplicity. Young men begin with ideas. Then they meet reality. Reality forces them to become practical. Practical survival forces them to narrow their moral world. When the war ends, the narrowed moral world does not widen easily. And then politics arrives with a story that offers to widen it again, but in the wrong direction. That is how a private wound becomes public danger. If you take nothing else from this whole chronicle, take that. Because it is not only Germany's story. It is the story of any society that asks its youth to absorb mass violence and then pretends they can come home unchanged. I have one more hook for you. The kind that people do not like because it points outward, not backward. What if the next crisis is already being written in the way we tell the last one? Not with rifles, but with language, with selective memory, with tidy myths, with the habit of turning suffering into moral proof. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because I have lived long enough to see patterns. The century does not repeat itself in exact detail, but it repeats its temptations. The temptation to simplify, the temptation to blame, the temptation to use pain as a recruiting tool, and the temptation to silence the inconvenient witness. That is why the German soldiers' diaries and letters, whether from the trenches of 1916 or the ruins of 1942, are not just artifacts. They are tests. They test whether we can look at suffering without turning it into a weapon. They test whether we can honor endurance without worshiping violence. They test whether we can remember honestly without needing revenge to make memory feel worthwhile. So I close my packet. I press the pages flat, not because paper needs it, but because it is a gesture of respect. And I sit for a moment in the quiet that follows, the kind of quiet you only find when the day's noise has ended and the mind can finally hear what it has been avoiding. The German soldier's voice, across both wars, tells you something nobody wants to learn the easy way. War is not only a contest of armies. It is a contest over meaning. If you win the meaning, you can lose the war and still prepare the next one. If you lose the meaning, you can win the war and still plant the seeds of future collapse. So the best case scenario for any society is not simply peace. It is a peace that is narrated honestly, a peace that does not need myths to survive, a peace that treats testimony as warning rather than fuel. And now, I'll leave you with the last question, the one I would ask any student of history who thinks the past is safely locked away. When you hear a story about sacrifice, do you ask who is selling it and what they want you to do next? Share this with your classmates and friends who think war history is only dates and battles. The real story is the one written in the margins by people who thought nobody would ever read them. When I set the last page down, the room feels quieter than it should. Not because the world outside has gone silent, but because the voices I have been listening to were never meant to carry this far. They were written by men who believed they were speaking to a mother, a wife, a friend, or to themselves in the brief minutes when the guns paused long enough for a pencil to move. And yet those small, private lines outlived the uniforms, outlived the trenches, and in some cases outlived the countries that sent them to war. That is the weight of what we have just walked through. Because these German soldiers did not merely describe battles, they described a transformation. They showed how a young mind, trained on ideas of duty and honor, can be reduced to a rhythm of hunger, fear, routine, and numb endurance. They showed how the body adapts to conditions that should be unlivable. And they revealed something even more unsettling, that when the fighting ends, the war does not end. It migrates. It moves into politics, into families, into the stories nations tell themselves when they are trying to live with what they have done. When the first war ended, the peace was supposed to seal the wound. Instead, the wound remained open. In that exposed space, the next decade grew its worst habits: denial, grievance, the addiction to simple explanations, the craving to turn sacrifice into redemption. And as those forces tightened their grip, the soldiers' testimony, which should have been a warning, became a resource to be managed. Some voices were elevated, others were attacked, and many were pushed into silence, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. The cost of that kind of secrecy is not only moral, it is strategic. A society that cannot look plainly at the truth becomes easy to steer with myths. A soldier who cannot speak openly becomes easy to recruit with a story that flatters his pain. And when memory is treated like property, the past stops being a teacher and becomes a weapon. Now we live in a post-war world that says it has learned. We have built new alliances, drawn new lines, and spoken new vows in public halls. And still, behind closed doors, the same old calculations are made. Men study morale the way engineers study stress fractures. They read letters and diaries as indicators, not merely as grief. They ask how long a population can endure scarcity, how quickly fear spreads, how easily pride can be triggered, how many days it takes before disbelief becomes collapse. That is, the sobering lesson of everything you have heard tonight. The human voice from the trenches did not just describe history. It became part of the machinery that shaped the next chapter. And as I gather these pages, I keep returning to one image. A lone desk lamp, thin paper, a final sentence scratched down by a hand that has been shaking too long. The ink dries, the room cools. Somewhere far away, a train whistle cuts through the night, and a man who survived wonders if survival will ever feel like living. I push the packet closed and stand for a moment, listening to the quiet that follows any hard truth once it has been spoken. Then I walk away from the table, leaving the words where they belong, not as trophies, not as slogans, but as witnesses. So here is my question for you, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments. When you hear a war story, do you think it's meant to warn you or to recruit you? Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our uploads. And as the light goes out and the last page rests in stillness, I can't help but wonder, with equal caution and curiosity, how many other quiet testimonies are still waiting to be heard before the world repeats what it swore it understood.